Hello everyone and welcome to the round glass review for the Vivitar 28mm f/28RL edition. This lens was released by Vivitar, but given the 28 prefix on the serial number, it was made by Komine. Komine also made an identical close-focus 28mm f/28 lens to this one, however it did not have any RL branding, so whether you have the RL or the just close-focus version of this lens, they're the same, as long as the serial number begins with 28. This lens dates from sometime in the mid-1980s, and based on the fact that my lens has a PKA mount, that's where I would get that from, but I could not find a clear year for when either the RL or the close-focus version of this 28mm lens was introduced. Typical lens uses will be as a general-use wide-angle lens, and the close-focus point it provides makes it fantastic as a general lens. The size makes it great for travel. Honestly, this is one of, if not the most useful 28mm lenses I've ever used. For your bottom line up front, this lens is best used close up and it performs well at close focus points. As a far and infinity focus lens, it ranges from unremarkable to highly disappointing. Your focal length and angle of view are 28mm and 75.4 degrees on full frame, 42mm and 53.7 on APS-C, and hey, this is just becoming a common thing on this channel now, 19.6mm and approximately 95 degrees on GFX. The aperture range is 2.8 through 16. Element and group count are 5 and 5. The design type is retrofocus. Filter size 49mm. The closest focus point is 0.23 meters, which in the US is 2/1000th of an SR-71 second. The drive type is manual focus only. The native mounts were Canon FD, Contax Yashica, Konica AR, M42, Minolta SR, Nikon F, Olympus OM, Pentax K, and Pentax KA. The dimensions are approximately 45 by 39mm, though the exact size will vary slightly by the mount. The weight is approximately 165 grams, and there will again be some variation by mount. Wide open, this lens tends to cast a strong green color tone onto images. Super simple to fix in post, especially if you shoot RAW. Just be aware of that, and it pretty much goes away after you start stopping down the lens. That's probably, by the way, due to some image flare inside of the lens, some overall whole image flare. Stop down, the tones that this lens delivers are much more normal. I would say neutral. They don't skew warm or cool in any direction. Flares when a bright light is slightly out of frame, but only at a specific angle and placement to the front of the lens, are strong. This can be fixed by moving slightly or stopping down any. And also, as we'll note in the flare and ghosting section, this could also be a really compelling image character, as some of the flare and ghosting is really captivating for certain images. And that big flare, by the way, tends to be a circular rainbow flare that really dominates the overall image. Next up, this lens is a fantastic choice for mirrorless users with a macro focusing to your mount adapter. The RL performs very well when racked out on a macro adapter and past this lens's focus point, closest focus point. Building on that, this lens really shines with close focus points, and what it can deliver as built, as well as closer than as built with macro focusing, really makes it a standout in this lens class. For photographers who like to get close and have a wide angle of view, this lens is really worth a second look. And lastly, this is an unusual optical design for the time, a 5.5 lens that's functionally a triplet with an element on each end. Very few lenses of this lens's era were that simple. Now, this has some pluses. It gives this lens a small size and a low weight. Those are really great positives. But there are some negatives too in terms of the way that this lens flares. Overall, this is a fantastic 28mm lens, and it makes me want to do a lens showdown of the same spec lenses of the era because I think this one would be pretty hard to beat. Starting with the test lights near the lens and the lens at infinity focus, we see a lot of projection-related cat-eye effect, and it starts in pretty quickly when moving away from the center of the image. By the corners, the round dots may as well be buttonholes. Also noteworthy here, there's a lot of smearing and flare, and the overall performance that this lens delivers at infinity in this test is rather ho-hum. if I'm being charitable, which I am. With the same lights and the lens at closest focus, we see some light soap bubble blur that's a combination of overcorrected spherical aberration and the general harshness of this test's post-processing regimen. What we see here is even blurry area illumination aside from the light perimeter brightness and even illumination across the color channels. The other noteworthy things here are that the smearing has disappeared, and this lens delivers much better blurry areas when focused close. As noted already, this lens in all ways works better when focused close up anyway. Looking at the whole image dots test chart, this is a solid performance with minimal distortion and no obvious flaws when looking at the whole test image. At the center of the image with a 100% crop, the small squares are a bit soft, but nothing that is out of line for a 28mm lens of this one's vintage. Honestly, this performance keeps pace with many, if not all, of the OEMs of the era. At the very perimeter dots on this crop, we do see slight projection-related chromatic blur. Around the corners, we do see absolutely stunning performance in the that outpaces most, if not all, of the comparable OEMs of this era. The dots are actually sharper in the corners, with the 4 pixels that comprise them being visible, and I don't think that's happened before on this test. Anyway, there is very minor chromatic blur and some essentially imperceptible projection blur related to some very minor spherical aberration. I'm not going to lie. This is not at all the performance I expected from this lens based on the real-world use that I got from it. This is a very good performance on this test by the standards of modern lenses. Breathing is slightly jarring in still shifts, but, though noticeable, also smooth in video use. The aperture is stepped and half-stop detents through f11, then a full-stop to f16. The front element is non-rotating, but does move in and out by 5.5mm, which is 20% of the lens focal length. Focus throw is about 230 degrees, with a stationary focusing ring that feels pleasant and easy to grip for manual focusing. Focus damping is pleasant, and this lens spins smoothly and with appropriate resistance. There is also no autofocus effect on audio because this is a manual focus lens. Sharpness is exceptional and will leave you wanting for nothing. For the crop sensor portrait shooter, this lens should hold up even on M43. The sharpness this lens delivers too is not clinical or obscene, but it feels lifelike and it creates images that carry the tangible feel of the place or subject within them. If you've heard me pay a better compliment to a lens than that in this series, please remind me of when. Build quality is very nice, and these have held up, but there will be some variation in focusing ring and aperture feel based on your lens's abuse over the years. Contrast is exceptional, and very little contrast adjustment is needed in raw editing. Aperture stars appear in a noticeable way at f11 and peak at f16. They aren't ever noteworthy and really are not worth using as an image element wider than f16. Out-of-focus areas are typical of retrofocus lenses in that they are jittery, and typically I hate that. I don't hate that with this lens at all. Something about this lens, and I think it has to do with the sharp, blurry transitions it delivers, makes the lens great for subject isolation, and the blurry areas tend to complement that well. Distortion is not represented well here because I had the camera aligned poorly. It does show a bit of barrel distortion, but the DOTS test chart showed none, which indicates that distortion is worse at different focal points, and that's often the case, by the way. Light loss will be tested on both full frame and GFX here. In real-world use, quickly, even on full frame, it is present, and to your discretion as to if that's a positive image character or not. On full frame, testing a white screen up close with this lens at infinity focus, light loss is present and strong with relatively uniform drop-off wide open, and it's essentially gone by f8, with f5.6 being an aperture at which light loss stops being an image element in real-world use. GFX does clip the image corner slightly across the aperture range, but looking at the same test on GFX, light loss is very strong, with the image circle becoming well-defined as the lens stops down. Flare and ghosting are present, with ghosting happening much less often than flare. Flare presents as a rainbow circle when wide open. The rainbow vanishes at f4. When ghosting occurs, it tends to travel with flare, and occurs when a strong light source is out of frame at an angle. As a personal aside, I could very easily see the flares this lens delivers wide open as being a beneficial image element as it relates to either still or motion storytelling. Balance with cameras is very front light. On film cameras of this lens's vintage, it feels fine. On heavy digitals like the A7 IV or Pentax K1, those cameras feel very body heavy, though on the former this lens is balanced slightly better. I picked up the Vivitar 28mm f2.8 close focus RL edition lens when a strong wind blew over my Pentax LX and the SMC 28mm it had mounted, dropping the full weight of the camera, my fully extended tripod, and all the inertia that carried right onto the front of the SMC-M 28mm mounted on the LX. The LX survived. The SMC-M's focusing helical apparently looked like the gearbox of a gated F-series Chrysler driven at full speed up a steep mountain while in first gear. While I liked that SMC-M 28mm f2.8, I am really glad it forced me to get the Vivitar because the Vivitar is a far more likable lens with significantly more usability. Vivitar lenses were, generally, pretty good and not much of a compromise from the OEMs at the time. Komine Vivitars, especially, made exceptional lenses and are a wonderful option that still performs well on both film and digital. But what does the RL edition mean, and what is different about this from the standard close-focus Komine Vivitar? You know, if anyone knows, I could not find that answer online, and none of my lens books had an answer either. I've read a lot of speculation, but honestly, who knows? So if you want a Vivitar lens of this spec, instead of looking specifically for the RL edition, look for a close-focus 28mm with a 28 prefix serial number. Hey, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one you'll probably really like too.